I first gave a sermon under this title, The Baby in the Bathwater, 15 years ago, when that picture would have really fit. That was after there'd been a spate of atheist bestsellers, and it came at a time 15 years ago when fundamentalist religion, aligned with reactionary political forces, was pumping a steady stink of filth into our cultural waters. Of course, that was a long time ago. Still, if titles like God is Not Great, The God Delusion, Breaking the Spell, and The End of Faith unleashed their own brand of overzealousness, they were surely crying out against a real threat that is still with us. 15 years on, paleo-religion, which I think is a good description for where we could have a museum that shows how God created dinosaurs within a week of human beings. Paleo-religion, well, how does that threat look today? The filth pumps keep pumping, perpetuating racial hatred and xenophobia, advancing our ecological destruction, lending votes and armies to robber baron overlords and oligarchs, threatening cherished and hard-won freedoms of speech and self-determination, threatening reproductive health, threatening children's mental health, threatening American democracy. We should be outraged at this. But weighing the merits of religion on the whole, as those helpful atheists invited, and as I did at the time, doesn't really seem as apt a response to me as it once did. In fact, for the context of a religion, that kind of Benjamin Franklin exercise on religion as a whole is sort of boring, when you could have stayed home and just listened to the punk band, Bad Religion, get the same concept. So at the level of argument, at an intellectual level, which is a habitual philosopher I'm inclined to be drawn toward, we want to give some emotional resonance too, but intellectually, I'm just going to leave it at what that great Christian C.S. Lewis is reported to have said about literal-minded Bible readers. If they don't know how to read books written for adults, they should stop talking about them. What's more interesting than a kind of, well, on balance, is religion as a whole this or that? What's much more interesting to me than that is whether there's a baby in all that foul water that's worth saving, or, if you prefer, whether there could ever have been a baby there at all. Dominic Crossan thinks so. He wrote a fat book and a skinny book of historical Jesus scholarship, and the hip scholar folks called the skinny one The Baby Jesus. Its real title is Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. Bishop Selby Spong worships the baby that needs to be saved from that bathwater. One of his titles is Why Religion Must Change or Die. Brian McLaren finds that we need Jesus for social justice and even our ecological survival. His title reflects that everything must change. Jesus, global crises, and a revolution of hope. But perhaps Bishop Desmond Tutu summed it up best with this title: God is not Christian. For me, I've made a kind of buffet out of religion, I admit it. There are some who criticize me for that, but I had to do that. I'm allergic to some of the prix menu items, not as much to miracles and things, but the notion of hell just doesn't sit at all well with me, given that God was supposed to be a loving father. I grew up Methodist. I grew outward from that, but still the strongest medicine in the Native American sense of that word that I bring to myself is Christmas carols. And I envy those of you who, with all the hours, the grave, the cross, the sky, will still be singing all those marvelous hallelujahs next Sunday. I envy you that. So what becomes more interesting to me than the content of the grave, the cross, the sky? What becomes more interesting to me than all those evaluations over the centuries of carnage and of wonderment is the perspectives and practices that authors like those or ordinary Christians in their pews or neighbors in their neighborhoods advance toward what seems to them and to many of us to be a better way of doing religion. More guided by reason or guided by conscience. So what I ask, what's interesting to me, is what religion can let us do well or better. I find it interesting that atheists have made the argument that by defending a religion that is more reasonable, people who are attempting to have a religion that would be okay with me, for one thing, are providing cover to the terrorists of the religious right. But, well, we can let that sort itself out. More interestingly, perhaps, when someone does that, when you start from religion and then say, well, I've left out the parts that seem to me morally reprehensible, like this land was given over to you as a people, kill them all. Slaughter them. This is your land now. That kind of thing, that's bad. So the more I filter that out, what the atheist authors have said is that I'm admitting that the real standard to be guided by is not the Scripture. The real standard to be guided by is not the ecclesiastical authority. It's the conscience, that little voice that may or may not be of God that we have within, but that was surely refined by centuries of Enlightenment morality and reflection that was not as much guided by those scriptural passages. So the atheist says, the more you say something outside religion needs to shape what you do with your religion, which makes a lot of sense to most of us, they're really on to something. Because then you can question whether the heart we're putting there is religion at all anymore. You might even imagine a denomination that calls itself a religion where people would burn a question mark on your lawn, as they're said to do to Unitarian Universalists. Well, I wonder if what we do in making religion more reasonable is to set reason or perhaps conscience up as a guide. Why not go directly to the source? Certainly this is what the atheists would have us do, right? Why bother with the mixture of mythology in that at all? Don't many younger people especially do exactly that when they stop going to church? Don't the demographics of the last several generations show a really precipitous decline in traditional religious attendance at the very same time that those who do attend often become more vociferously active, as if to demonstrate that they're not dead yet? Well, if that's the case, perhaps religion just isn't the thing for younger people, not an issue to decide or a side to choose or even an enigma to be puzzled. I remember walking with my daughter one time. She used to go with us to our Unitarian Universalist church that my then wife discovered when she was looking for something spiritual in her life, and I really took to it. And my background was teaching philosophy. And my daughter said, Dad, she was probably middle school, probably high school at that point. She says, Dad, I get why it's important to think about those questions in philosophy and religion. I really understand that. It's good to think through those things so you understand there are different ways to approach it and get. But once you've done that, if you have a sense of how to live, do you really need to keep thinking about those questions? Fine for you to do it, but and I totally get that. It makes sense. Because someone like me who's really fascinated by that and is by nature philosophical, sure, I can't let go of that bone. My daughter, bless her soul, an accountant, successful, I was delighted when I visited last week that my granddaughter was singing a couple of songs that she'll be singing with her Episcopal preschool in their little program. And so hearing my not yet 4-year-old granddaughter sing, Jesus loves the little children, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight, was a really wonderful thing for Pop to hear. I loved it. Those who've turned away from religion, are they missing something? It's an interesting question I'm not going to answer this morning. Even if those folks turn away from religion to cultivate a more urbane or nuanced spirituality, is there some uncharted territory beyond my daughter's mental maps that has a value religion somehow connects us with? That one's left for you, as they used to say in the algebra books or whatever. You solve this one. I won't speak directly to that this morning, except to play on the limits of that horizon. It isn't belief that's really interesting to me anymore. And you'll hear me saying at different times, well, this is interesting, this isn't interesting. I was thinking, as I was going back to this really old sermon that I wrote, where the world hasn't changed, but I have, I was recalling something I'd seen in a book about writing that said, they told a story of an author who was really popular, and people loved reading this author's books, and they said, well, gosh, how do you do that? And the author said, it's easy. You know how when people read things and they skip over that part to get to the good part? You just only write the good parts and leave the rest out. So when I was going back to the sermon, before I even looked at it again, I said, all right, let me think. What are the parts you would skip to instead of away from? I'll put those in. Anyway, if you could excuse me for a moment, my mouth gets dry when I talk too much, as I often do, and I've got a little bit of something here. With no secret additives, thank you. So, what interests me is not the content of the belief. What interests me is faith, which is not the same as holding a belief. In the days of the early Christians, we read that many, many people found their example inspiring. That how they would face death, how they would worship together, just how they were in the world, was amazing and inspiring. And that's why there was this phenomenal growth of the community of early Christianity. Now, they didn't face the trials that Christians face today. There was no magic kingdom. There was no terrifying Mickey Mouse to groom children into transgenderism. Their crosses were merely wood, and not the horrifying wokeism that some face today. Even so, there were at least some challenges that enabled those early Christians to set an example that interested people. If I were going to try to characterize faith, I hate definitions. I'm too open-ended for that. But if I were doing a kind of characterization of it, I might start by thinking of faith as a durable, intuitive disposition. Intuitive as opposed to rational, but durable, not just a whim or a momentary thing. Durable does not mean that it can't be destroyed. It only means that it may be weather resistant or water resistant or even woke resistant in some context. But disposition as an inclination to be a certain way, a tendency to do certain kinds of things, a sort of gearing toward, a lean is a good way to think of it. But faith could also be, in many cases, or for many people, an explicitly chosen or affirmed commitment, like a leap of faith. I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm doing it. And I wonder if the great, no, he wasn't great, but the minor philosopher George Michaels ventured that you've got to have faith. And we're going to steer clear of the great philosopher who once said you got to serve somebody. We're not going there. But the minor philosopher who said you got to have faith, is there some truth in that? Do you need something like faith to get by? Is there something to get through the night that's going to be your faith? Do you need to have faith in people, faith in yourself, faith in something? So that's an interesting question to me because it goes to what's at issue when we take on religion. And so I think that gets a lot clearer when we look at the atheist arguments, which I'm going to do now. But I'm going to look at them less in terms of tit for tat, from the perspective of some distance and the perspective of history. I'm guided by a really wonderful historian, Yuval Harari, an Israeli, who in 2015 wrote a book that's been a really consistent New York Times bestseller that I recommend to anyone interested in big picture history. The book is called Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind. The atheists place their faith in reason and logic, and especially in science. Harari notes that the very notion of progress arose in connection with the scientific revolution. That all over the world, multiculturally, multi-historically, multi-epochally, the way human beings have been able to live together for millennia, for eons, had nothing to do with a goal of progress. There might have been temporary ambitions and expansions and even empires, but the notion of progress, as we think of it, came with the scientific revolution and the consequential Enlightenment period in philosophy and letters, right? But get this about the scientific revolution. Harari writes, the scientific revolution has not been a revolution of knowledge. No, well then what? It has been, above all, a revolution of ignorance. The greatest human discovery of the scientific revolution was that humans do not know the answers to their most important questions. Are there any philosophers in the room? Does that remind you of anybody a couple millennia ago who didn't get a cross but some hemlock? My buddy Socrates, man. That sounds so Socratic. And Harari, as a historian, is saying that is the very essence of science. Socratic in that sense of, we must first recognize that we don't know the answers. Really, we may be able to reconcile the Bible and Aristotle just fine, but we don't know the answers. And we don't know the answers to the most important questions. That one's going to come back at us when we're thinking about faith and what we have faith in. Because we may know the answers about a lot of things, of periodic tables and blah, blah, blahs. But I, as a philosopher, am very interested in the answers to the questions that matter the most to human beings as human beings. That's what I'm going to ride for the rest of my sermon today. One of the things that Harari noted as an innovation around that time was that maps that used to be complete now had empty spaces for uncharted territory. What does that do? It changes the world I live in. From a world that is a known totality with closed bounds, that may have an ordered structure where each has her place. I'm sure they put it in gender-appropriate terms, too. Now, look at a map of uncharted territory, of an unknown that no one has even reported about. Well, doesn't that just dare one to explore? Doesn't that just get you thinking what else might be out there? Isn't that a fundamental and profound change in the world I live in and even in who I might be? Wow. And what that emblematizes, if you will, what that's emblematic of, he corrected himself, is exactly that notion of using our ignorance to progress. And that is what science does. So whenever the utilizers, whenever the advocates, whenever the proselytizers and the zealots of science, most of whom are not scientists, but philosophers of science, prophesy that all truth is almost there. We're almost there. Just a couple more things to get done. I have to be suspicious of that. I have to react against that zeal, even if it isn't quite as deadly, or at least as evidently deadly, as paleo-religion is. Harari notes that scientific progress has been immense. Steven Pinker wrote a book with a perfect title, Enlightenment Now, pointing out all the miracles that the application of Enlightenment thinking and the developments and progress of science have had. It's really wonderful stuff. It's like amazing how we didn't have to wait to the timetable of the millennial goals to meet them. It's like, bam, got those done. Just throw some money and some information technology at it. So much can be done. And yet, Harari also notes there's a huge gap opening between the tenets of liberal humanism and the latest findings of the life sciences. A gulf we cannot ignore much longer. When he says liberal humanism, he's talking about this philosophy that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and before that the defeat of Nazism, that pretty much the whole world is on board with the notions of enlightened progress, a general sense of the values of the Enlightenment kind of spreading throughout our world. But that involves the affirmation of human dignity. That involves notions like there's something special about a human life. Think about it. Is there something special about a human life? If there is, why do you say that? Where does it come from? It doesn't come from a science book. Because increasingly what those sciences tell us is the smart gene does this. It's all just the unfolding of something we can map with artificial intelligence, understand through genetic theory. You put those together in the right way, and you get an interesting picture that is reflected in a title by a really brilliant and interesting to read philosopher named Daniel Dennett, who wrote Brainstorms, seems like a century ago. And his more recent title sums up what my concern is here. From bacteria to Bach and back again, the evolution of minds. I love the bacteria to Bach part. What does "and back again" mean? From Bach to bacteria? I wonder, in terms of that question, do you gotta have faith? If your faith is in some combination of genetics, information theory, artificial intelligence, filtered through an advocacy for science, and not just a suspicion, but a rejection out of hand, as is the case with Dennett. He was one of those great atheist authors of 15 years ago or so. If that's what you're doing, where have you placed your faith? What does that mean? Okay, You may have faith that we will understand this before we're extinct. Oh, this is what we're going to die of. It won't be fire or ice. It will be, maybe. But I find that back worth noting. So I want to turn back to and upon the neo-atheist challenge with a sort of challenge that comes from, maybe not faith, but maybe from the far edges of the map. The atheist authors admit that one cannot prove a negative, such as there is no God or God does not exist. It's just a feature of logic, nothing even interesting really. But it does mean that they can't prove what they most want to say. Ergo, says I, their arguments cannot have deductive force. I'm going to turn logic teacher here just for a minute because I think this is profoundly important at the level of individual lives of ordinary people, okay? In logic, there's a distinction between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning that we throw around all the time, and you all have some sense of it, at least inductively. In inductive reasoning, I go out and I start collecting samples or watching people and seeing what happens. And you know what, it's almost always the case that when this happens, that happens. That's inductive reasoning. I'm generalizing from a lot of instances. And the more carefully I control the selection of those instances, the more instances I have, the higher the n, the blah, 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 the more confidence I'm going to have in the conclusion. So statisticians have whole mathematical games they play with levels of confidence, all that fun stuff that anyone who's ever failed statistics still delights in. Deductive reasoning is easier than that. Deductive reasoning begins from something that has to be true. And then just says, well, if that has to be true, there's a lot of things that follow from that real easily. Let's suppose that we take as our axiom, all crows are black. Now, if you've seen a white crow, or if you, well, it may or may not be, okay, granted. The axiom's the thing. Once you give away the axiom, the game is done. What do I know if I know that that's a crow? It's inside a box. I can't look at it. But I know that all crows are black, and I know that that's a crow, let's say. If I know it's a crow, what do I know about it? It has to be black because it's that all, right? That is deductive reasoning. Many atheists want to speak as if there's been enough whatever to let them work from something like an axiom that says religion is bad. Now, they're not generally going to say all religion is bad. They're not going to trash Martin Luther King as a rule. But they'll just leave the all out and say, religion is this, religion is this. They will totalize. In other words, they will stereotype. They'll take a prejudice. They'll lump it together. They'll lop off all the decimal places that you're supposed to have when you're showing your work on your answer and just say, well, the answer's 3. What do you know? A pi is 3. It's 3 point something, right? So if I were able to start with religion is bad. Oh, you believe in Jesus? Well, what do I know about you? You go to church, what do I know about you? Why you do that? And it may be that they don't do it quite that bluntly. But what I want to say is this is really important in our age intellectually. Logically, no one is entitled to criticize any individual. Criticize is not quite the word I want. To judge and to dismiss any individual's faith practice or personal beliefs simply on the grounds that it's connected with religion. Okay? You can't judge somebody because they believe in Allah. Unfair. Now, that said, whether your faith is in Jesus or genetics, in AI or Allah, you can be held accountable for your witness. You can be held accountable for the example of your actions. We can say anything that is socially entitled to our role with respect to you about the evidence of your life. And if the great atheist existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre is right, you are your life and nothing else. So when you die, that's what there is of you. And that's what we would look to. Faith is like the blank space on that uncharted map. It may guide us. It may guide us if we are open in our ignorance. And it may be that we are guided, at least in times and places, in ways that we're better off for, whether we understand that or not, whether we understand why or not, whether you like it or not. And this brings me to the big conclusion about faith that I think is one of the best ideas I've ever had in years, decades of philosophizing, really. Recall how atheists celebrate rationality, right? I'm going to read you my formula. It is reasonable to place a higher value on what a person does than on the rational coherence of their belief system. I'm going to explain that a little bit in different words, then I'm going to repeat it. We're looking for what's rational. And so the atheists say, well, all your beliefs are wrong. They're unjustified, they're crazy, they're contradictory, blah, 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 blah. I don't care what your beliefs are. It's not rational to think your rational beliefs are the most important thing. If you hold all the right rational beliefs and you're kicking my daughter around, If you hold all the wrong beliefs and you're making the world a better place, okay. That's reasonable. It's reasonable for me to say that it's more important how you live than what goes on in your little rational brain. I don't care how smart you are. Of course, if you publish books, then what you write is part of what you do, right? But I think this is profound because it takes the notion of what's rational or reasonable, just uses that nice little philosophical move of elevating it up one level to the second order. And instead of talking about what's a rational belief, we say, well, is it rational to say the most important thing is whether your beliefs are rational? And so I'll say it again, see if you can agree with me in this conclusion. It is reasonable to place a higher value on what a person does than on the rational coherence of their belief system. So if someone finds that an African Methodist Episcopal church helps save them from the life they see their friends going through, that could be okay, even if it's based on mythology. We could end up feeding homeless people doing that. We could end up with all kinds of things. At most and at best, some of us might even find something to feed that hunger for answers that don't yet appear on the defined part of the map. I want to close today with exactly the close that I had 15 years ago. If you belong to or identified with a faith tradition that is replete with fundamentalism, lend your voice to its reformation. If, like us, you belong to or identify with a religion that embraces reason, spread the good word, the gospel, that there are religious communities in which you don't have to choose between faith and reason, spirituality and science. Bring your witness. Build your churches. Make a difference in the world, not just by comforting the afflicted, but by sharing a vision of faith that stands with the oppressed, that isn't a tool of the oppressor, and I would add, that stands up for another text, sacred in its own way. The Constitution of the United States of America. Thank you.